Welcome everyone to my once in every 6 months patch notes rundown. Why today, Curtis? That is a great question. It's a big patch. This is arguably potentially bigger than the preseason patch. There is a lot here that is going to change the average mid laner's journey. I love mid laners, and mid laners are the best. I'm there to help you guys, you mid laners. We're going to cover the things that are going to affect you guys on your mid lane journey. So, kicking it right off, Akshan. Now, they just added essentially, a bit of AP ratio to a few of his abilities. Riot, Big Brain, Mega Brain, Giga Brain, with the Guinsoo's Rageblade coming into fruition, which we'll talk about in a second. It's going to synergize beautifully. My prediction is that Akshan is going to be quite out of control. It wouldn't surprise me if they're just going to have to tone down Akshan a little bit, or maybe adjust the item itself for Guinsoo's. My prediction is that Akshan is probably going to be ban-worthy in most ELO brackets. I don't even think Akshan is that weak of a champion in its current form anyway. So, Akshan will be coming to a solo queue game near you. I'm just going to cover the things that are relevant to mid laners. None of this really tickles my fancy here. Moving on to BT. Now, they've removed the shielding on BT, which, to be honest, was a great choice. I don't think it was overly healthy for the game. This is going to make it easier for us to kill those pesky AD carries in the mid to late game. They've changed the passive here. While above 50% health, gain an additional 10 to 40 attack damage. This is a viable item still, I believe, on Yone, Yasuo, potentially. I don't think it's nearly as good, though. Very niche. And because you are going to be trading a lot of damage, probably not the best item for those champions. So typically, I would say this is going to be more of an AD carry champion. Gale Force, basically unchanged. Now, moving on to Guinsoo's. This is the big one. So, Guinsoo's is now a mythic item, not a legendary, 3,200 gold. The mythic passive is very good. It grants 5% armor pen and 6% magic penetration upon every other legendary item. This is going to be great on Akshan, especially now that they've altered those AP scaling ratios. My prediction is this is going to make bot lane, Cogmore, an absolute menace. It wouldn't surprise me if we see an entire meta surrounded around it, to be honest. And, with the general direction Riot is kind of pushing in this patch, it is going to be quite a bot-centric meta, which is something we're going to be kind of seeing as the major theme throughout this rundown. I think this is actually going to potentially bring ADTF back, maybe. I think this suits ADTF quite well, although the reduction in the attack speed, questionable. We will talk about ADTF in a second when we get to Rapid Fire Cannon. But yeah, amazing on that. Cassante, not really going to affect many other mid laners. I think this is more going to be a top and AD carry-esque item. Now, the one question I have gotten about this is, will you build this on Yone? No, you won't build it on Yone because of this passive here. It actually converts your crit strike chance into raw damage. But in doing so, it actually removes that 2.5% amplification in your crit. So it doesn't actually scale with that on hit. So this is not a great item on Yone, unfortunately. And this is going to be one of the themes throughout this video as well. Yone itemization did get a little bit pigeonholed. There are some positives, but a lot of negatives. Moving on, big ones. Shield Bow, now a legendary item, not a mythic. Now, they did remove the attack speed, which basically prevents it from being rushed as a mid laner, right? So Yone is not going to be rushing this item, nor is Yasuo. We're going to need some sort of attack speed / lifesteal item, which basically leaves Bork being the best item for Yone. And, there are going to be maybe some iterations with PD or Shiv, but for the most part, I think Bork is going to be kind of the go-to item for Yone. Look, I think you can build it later on. Maybe you can go kind of like a Bork, Zeal, and get like a Shield Bow later on, potentially. But it's just not going to be an early game item. Now significantly cheaper. And even they said here, Shield Bow is not meant to be bought early, as the shield does not increase until level 12, which makes sense. So a little bit more of a niche item. IE is now a mythic, which is very important, which means that you're pigeonholed as Yone Yasuo as your mythic. Because obviously IE, very valuable with the Yone and the Yasuo, which is interesting. Kraken, now a legendary. It's still going to have, that anti-tank flavor, but as they said, it's not going to be a replacement for the Lord Doms. You know, I think a lot of this itemization is going to affect Tristana mid. I actually think Tristana is getting an indirect buff by a lot of these, you know, these items. A lot of these are great items. So yeah, so 80, you know, those 80 carry mids could come back into flavor. Even Vayne mid could come back into flavor, especially as we see down here. So actually, I'm just going to skip forward a little bit. Static Shiv really complementing those low wave clear mids. I think Quinn got a pretty big buff from the introduction of Shiv, because Shiv obviously been great for champions that lack wave clear. Vayne might be an interesting one that comes back in some way, shape, or form. I think this is a very interesting introduction. But yes, going back to my initial point, I think Tristana mid could be interesting. Now, there are some changes later on in the patch that I will address that kind of nerf Tristana indirectly, but it's just something on my radar because I do think Tristana is a little bit of an underrated pick. Now, as for the important stuff for mid laners, Navori, again, not really relevant for most mid laners here. PD, interesting, increase in attack speed at a bit of increased cost, but relevant again for Yone Yasuo. What is also interesting here is that rapid fire cannon now grants attack damage and is 500 gold more expensive. Now, this actually screws over APTF, right? Because the only reason APTF got this is because it was cheap. It gives you that additional range for those long-range snipe gold cards, give you a little bit of attack speed. But now they've reduced the attack speed, added attack damage. This is a buff to ADTF, but a bit of a nerf to APTF, which is a little bit of a shame, but it is what it is. Runaan's pretty big buff as well. And as you can see, a lot of these 80 carry-esque items are getting buffed and altered in a way that is favorable for the bot lane. So again, 80 carries are going to be very happy. This one especially synergizing beautifully with Guinsoo's. It's going to be an absolute nightmare to deal with, especially Guinsoo's, Runaan's 2-item spike. I mean, maybe they don't get a second item. I'm not an 80 carry expert. You get the point though. This is a boatload of damage. And in my opinion, the way this is shaping up to be is that there's going to be a lot of enchanters with, you know, hyper carry, 80 carry. So, like I said before, Static Shiv coming back, an interesting item. There might be some niche 80 mids that come back into the meta because of this, because a lot of 80 mids are actually gated by their lack of wave clear. Even Graves, I think Graves could potentially come back into the meta with this item. Graves has always traditionally been quite good with Static Shiv, which is interesting. Stormrazor, an interesting item. Its early damage is roughly in line with the last version of the item, but the added damage scaling should help it remain valuable later on. The solo has been transformed into a selfish movement speed buff. Okay, so it's buffing you up rather than kind of being a bit of annoying onto the enemy, right? So it's simple, essentially a similar item. Lethality increase or collector, interesting. Zeal, now this is quite relevant. Zeal, a little bit more expensive and less attack speed and less movement speed. So, bit of a nerf, I think, to Yone Yasuo, especially that Bork Zeal build path as well. So as you can see, the build path for Yone Yasuo is going to be shifting around quite a bit. Now on to some spicy stuff for you assassin players. Duskblade. So this is an interesting one. So it's kind of, in my opinion, a bit of a net buff, because if you actually take a look at it here on this unique passive here, when a champion you have damaged within the past 3 seconds dies, you become invisible for 1.35 seconds. That's what it used to be. Now you become untargetable, kind of like Gwen W. So this allows you to kind of run rampant in a team fight, or, you know, and be quite pesky and annoying. Yes, they've removed this and changed it around a little bit. I'll have to feel this one out to really see how this feels, but in my opinion, this is actually quite a good change. It's going to be quite annoying for mage players and 80 carries, which makes sense given the buffs to 80 carries. But thumbs up for Zed players, Talon players, Kiana players. This might be an interesting item to invest in. Now, Prowlers, though, now moving to a legendary tier item. This is a big nerf to a lot of, to some specific, not a lot of champions, specific champions. I'm glad they mentioned Rek'Sai. Rek'Sai as a champion, quite annoying for mobile mages. Thrived on this one because then he could burrow, he could like flash, and then Prowlers, right? And things like that. So this is gonna, in my opinion, really hurt Rek'Sai players. So yeah, I'm sorry. I'm sorry, Rek'Sai mains out there. Talon as well is probably not going to really invest too much in this one. I think, Youmuu's is probably going to be the big go-to item. I think this is an interesting one. Now, Youmuu's is more is a mythic. Now, what they've done is given it a lot more lethality. From what I've heard with people testing around on this, on the PBE, this is going to give a lot of damage. This is probably going to be the go-to assassin item on Zed, Zed, Talon, Kiana, etc. Now, look, there's still going to be, I'm assuming, use cases for Duskblade, but Youmuu's really looks to be the big one here. So, in a way, they're kind of buffing assassins, I guess, to cater for the AD carry buffs, which makes sense. But later on, as you'll see with the AP item buffs, it's going to be a bit of a double-edged sword, which we'll come back to this, because I think there's a bit of context we're missing here. Now, the only support item that I'm really going to touch on is the Abyssal Mask. This is an incredibly interesting item, because even though it is meant to be for support tanks, a lot of mid laners can utilize this. So it's very cheap. It gives, a decent amount of HP, ability haste, thumbs up, and a lot of magic resist. And it still has that unique passive there. Not the unique passive Eternity, which not really as important, but the reduction of the magic resistance is still there. So champs like Ryze, Swain, some others off the top of my head that I'm forgetting, like even Cassiopeia to a certain extent, will be enjoying this change. I personally don't think this will stay around for long. I think this is a little bit too cheap. In my opinion, this will be adjusted. But when this patch comes out, I think a lot of people will be looking to abuse this, maybe even tank Kassadin or something. I don't know. I think there are going to be some use cases this for sure creatively. The main thing that you need to understand about support items is that they're all getting cheaper and actually a bit of a buff. There's more options for enchanters, things like Karma, to give them a little bit more lane strength at the sacrifice of utility. But TLDR, cheaper, more effective items, better build paths, and I guess Mikhail's not having magic resist anymore is also something worth noting, because especially if you played any AP assassin, that could be quite annoying, but that's not really the case anymore. So yeah, TLDR, bot lane being stronger, not just because of the AD carry items, but also a lot of the support items, and I think specifically enchanters as well. Now, moving on, Force of Nature nerfs, very, very good for us AP mage players, especially now dissipating, or here no longer giving multiplicative magic damage reduction. So shout out to Cassiopeia mains who are going to enjoy this change, alongside, here just skipping forward a little bit, more. And this is actually a bit of a nerf to more. Now the lifeline cooldown being 90 seconds and the lifeline shield duration being 2.5 seconds rather than 5, which is also a buff to mages and AP champions in general as well. So there's a bit of like a nerf to some of those tank items, which is great. Thumbs up, making mages a little bit more effective. Now to the big one, right? This is what a lot of people were spazzing out over. The 1100 gold lost chapter. Now, there's a few important things to note. Now that it has the same cost as a Dirk, a lot of mages are now able to forego that power trough. So there was a very interesting thing. Let's say you're playing a mage into a Talon, or a mage into a Zed, or a Kiana, or something like that. Any champion that can rush Dirk. Typically what you would see is, because Dirk is significantly cheaper, that 1100, and it's very hard to actually elongate a lane phase to 1300, there'd be this weird little phase where they would go back for Dirk, because they can even start a longsword as well, and you would come back and have to get like an Am Tomb or a Sapphire Crystal, or even like a Cloth Armor to negate this Dirk, and it would delay your lost chapter significantly. Now that it's both, now that Lost Chapter is 1100, you can kind of match that power spike quite effectively. So it won't surprise me if, a lot of those Mage v Assassin matchups are a lot easier from the Mage's perspective because of the cheaper Lost Chapter. As well, if you go the appropriate runes and setup, you could probably even get your Lost Chapter by wave 4, right? 4th wave, which is pretty insane. Which is great. So overall, a huge buff to mages. Any Lost Chapter reliant champion, the classic control mages like the Victor, the Syndra, the Orianna, again, I love this. Even Ari's going to like this. She is also quite Lost Chapter dependent. So big thumbs up for mages across the board there. Outside of that, not really too much that's overly important. Now for the more game-oriented changes. This is kind of the fundamental reason why I wanted to actually do a patch rundown, because these are quite big. So we'll kind of, I guess, preface this by what Riot said. So essentially, their goal is to make lane phase less about roaming and more about kind of the lane, because it seems at the moment they think that roaming early and snowballing sides is typically the best way to go about things. So they kind of want to shift some things around. So the first one, we now get more mana regeneration in the fountain, which is great. Now, this allows you to match tempo versus roaming assassins, right? So a lot of the time what would happen is that assassin would kind of reset. You would feel obliged to reset as well to replenish your resources, but then you would have to wait in base to replenish your mana. They wouldn't. And then, you know, sometimes assassins could kind of like, you know, escape and get back to lane first and then shove and roam. It's just going to help in general, just getting back onto the map, and being more impactful. So this is a good one. It is going to make, again, it's a kind of like an indirect buff to mages. Home guard timer is interesting. This is a bit of a double-edged sword, right? Because in a way, now home guards being at 14 minutes instead of 20, you could view it as like, yeah, mages are going to have an easier time coming back, tempo resetting, keeping people in lane, stuff like that. But to be honest, it doesn't really change that much because it's at 14 minutes and lane phase is over by then. I think this is more of like a game holistic thing. They want people to be able to come back out the map faster because the game pace is faster and it's just more healthy for the game. But you could also view it in the sense that, okay, now assassins or champions that can roam around the map have easier access to get back on the map faster, so they can shove and move a little bit earlier, things like that. So I think this is a bit of a negligible change when I think about it, because by 14 minutes, the map's already opened up anyway with how fast solo queue is. So that's, whatever. Blast cones now spawning at 9 minutes instead of 5 minutes. So again, Riot are trying to reduce those early roams and early ganking pressure, slow down the lane phase, make the lane phases more elongated, more isolated 1v1s and 2v2s, which is a thumbs up for mages like Victor, Orianna, Syndra, etc. that like those elongated lane phases. Now, this one, I've heard a lot of different takes about this, how now the mid lane minions will meet at the same time as side lanes, so more specifically, the side lane minions will be sped up. This falls off after 14 minutes. You know, at first glance, a lot of people panic because they're thinking, oh, now it's going to be so hard to roam. And yes, objectively, it will be a little bit harder to roam. But when I think about it in my games anyway, and what I see in my clients' games, it's very rare you're roaming, you know, off like a one-wave shove and then be like, oh, okay, now I want to roam. Yes, those opportunistic roams exist. Most of the time, your roams are going to be off like your bot lane doing a 2-stack or a 3-stack, or maybe they've got the wave frozen. I really don't think this has much of an effect on mid lane as much as it actually affects bot lane. Because now the minions actually come out faster, I believe bot lane is a little bit more snowball-centric in the sense that, let's say in bot lane you win a 2v2. Now because the waves comes faster, you can actually deny more waves because the wave will actually come to lane faster while they're dead. So in a way, I think it's a potentially going to make bot lane a little bit more snowbally. So yeah, I think this actually affects bot lane more than it does affect mid lane. But yes, it will have an effect, I just think very minimally. The other little change here is that minions won't really help you when you're diving. They're just going to stick on the tower. Again, a little thing. Turrets are going to be a little bit more tanky, so this is kind of what negates those Tristana buffs in my opinion, because yeah, Tristana typically wants to play for plate, same with his champ like Echo and Diana. It's a bit of an indirect nerf to those champions that love getting plates. So again, it looks like what they're trying to do is slow down the lane, and make it, I guess, a more elongated lane phase, and when someone dies or roams or something like that, it's less punishing in a way. Rather than the towers just exploding very early in the game. So, very interesting. I think this is kind of an indirect buff to assassins, because if you roam as an assassin, you're not going to get your entire tower exploded, which is interesting. So, notice how there's a bit of a tug of war going on here. There's some assassin buffs, there are some mages buffs, but then there is also some AD carry buffs and support buffs. So, it's like things are getting kind of pulled and pushed around everywhere. And the last one, TP. Unleash TP now at 10 minutes instead of 14 minutes, which makes 2v2s in the side lanes, and there's counter TPs and stuff more prevalent, which means there's probably going to be more 3v3s, 4v4s, and fights in the side lanes, especially bot lane, because I believe this is going to be a very bot-centric meta. Some trinket changes, you can read over that. I think the main thing here is that if you spot the enemy with your far side, your far side alteration here, it actually pings them when they're revealed on the map, and then after it gets detected, or the enemy gets detected, it will kind of expand and then self-destruct, which is cool. And that's basically it. Now I want to kind of round this video by talking about predictions. So I've made some notes here that I kind of want to talk about. So I think objectively, let's actually get it out of the way, pro play. Look, I think pro play will personally be negatively impacted because it's going to be a very bot-centric meta, and it already kind of was, in my opinion, a bot-centric meta, as we're already seeing now with MSI. And in my opinion, it's going to slow down the pro play meta, which I don't know if that's what they intended. I don't know. From what I heard, I think Freak said something about how AD carry feels like an unsatisfying role or a low-impact role. I don't even necessarily think that's objectively true. I think that's just the way it feels. Because in my opinion, I think a lot of good quality Jinx players or Xayah players or Felios players are definitely having excess in solo queue. I think it's more the feel, and I know Riot, after speaking to Froxon on the BBC episode, that they really want... League's a very feel-oriented game, and they want players who play the role to feel like they're having impact. So I think they probably had to, I guess... I don't know if compensate is the right word, but they wanted to kind of make AD carry feel like or just objectively be a more impactful role. So yes, we are going to see, in my opinion, a more bot-centric meta. Especially with Kog'Maw, coming back, and then chances, I think it's going to all be played around bot side, and also laning phase is going to be more elongated, which makes it a more mages as well. Maybe also because bot is unpopular. Maybe bot, because I think objectively bot is one of the least popular roles, or AD carry is one of the least popular roles. So maybe they want more people to play AD carry again. I don't know. I'm just spitballing here. As for mid lane, I think the meta is going to shift a lot back to a lot of lane dominant mages like Victor, Syndra, maybe even Ori making a little bit of a resurgence. I do think champs like Lux, and ASOL, and even Anivia are going to be getting slight, I think indirect buffs there. But something we've got to keep in mind is that even though Yone has been getting consistently indirectly nerfed by all these kind of itemization changes and stuff, he does objectively do quite well into a lot of mages, especially Orianna and Victor. So it wouldn't surprise me if maybe Yone it's kind of like an indirect buff there. So yeah, Yone will be an interesting one because yes, he does have a linear build path in my opinion nowadays, with Bork probably being the main item that you want to rush. And he has got kind of nerfed in a way because those assassin items, we might see a little bit more Zed, and Zed is an actual pain in the ass for Yone. So Yone is an interesting one and a bit of a mystery to me. I think champions like Galio and Rumble got absolutely screwed here. They were really reliant on those early roams. They don't like elongated lane phases. They hate it when the enemy is able to get an easy lost chapter. So, rip those two champions. I think Pantheon is a hit or miss, right? Because Pantheon can actually facilitate bot lane quite well, can escape mid lane without necessarily having to roam like a traditional mid laner would, just kind of just teleporting there, similar to that of a TF, and does benefit from some of the changes to Youmu's and stuff like that. So Pantheon is an interesting one, and I do think he's kind of under the radar at the moment, underappreciated. TF, I think, might make a bit of a resurgence. I think Karma mid might make a little bit of a resurgence. Like I said, I think Graves mid could come back with Static Shiv. Quinn mid, benefiting from the Static Shiv changes. These are all kind of niche picks that might really rise in popularity a little bit. ADTF being one that could also utilize Guinsoo's potentially. I think Ahri is a tough one because Ahri is a bit of a coin flip, right? Because she does benefit objectively from the Lost Chapter buffs. But she doesn't really like elongated 1v1 lanes, right? Because she kind of gets shit on. She has a weak laning phase. She loses to Victor, she loses to Ori, she loses to Syndra, a lot of these champions. But she can be a good complementary secondary carry and is good around facilitating AD carries with that Everfrost build. So yeah, it's a bit of a hit or miss. I think Ahri overall though, it's a net nerf and she won't be as popular, but I still think she'll be definitely viable. Other than that, it'll be hard. I mean, it's hard for me to tell. I think there's a lot up in the air. I think objectively it's going to be a mid to bot-esque meta. So overall, if you're a AD carry player, you're happy. If you're a support player, you're happy. If you're an assassin player, I think I think it's an interesting one because I think that there are some buffs and some nerfs. I think dealing with a lot of mages in lane will be harder, right? Because the Lost Chapter buffs, also just the lane phases maybe being a little bit more elongated. But I think the buffs to those lethality items is interesting and could maybe override those nerfs. We'll have to see how that one plays out. If you're a mage player, I think overall you're very happy, and especially if you're you love your Lost Chapter over that Rod of Ages. If you have any questions about anything I covered here today, let me know. There's a lot here to unpack. Otherwise, I will be on your YouTube feed very soon with a guide, specifically a Kassadin guide. So, otherwise, yeah, good luck with your solo queue, guys, and I'll see you around. Cheers.